Welcome back to my channel for a different episode than what I'm normally doing. Most of the content on my channel is about photography and photography gear, photography techniques, image quality, lens tests, camera tests, tutorials, what have you. I think I should stop the list here. This time I want to talk about an essential accessory, essential equipment you need if you are a pro photographer, and that's storage. Why is storage becoming an issue? Well, for instance, here I have my Leica SL3, and if I shoot in a RAW format, file size becomes significant. It gets even bigger if I shoot with my Hasselblad X2D Mark II or with my Fuji GFX 100 Mark II. Not talking yet about Phase 1 IQ4 file size, which is even bigger. And I also, of course, do regular backups of data I have stored on my MacBook Pro. I have an M4 silicon chip on it, and I do regular backups, of course, to make sure I don't lose data. And for all of that, I appreciate storage solutions with high transfer rates. And that's what this video is actually all about. I will explain everything I have here in front of me on the table in a moment to you, but now let's kick this off. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, please do so. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, support my work. Many thanks. All right, let me talk about the background of this video. And the background is very simple. A company called TerraMaster, here you see the logo, sent me an email, said, we like your content on your channel, but do you not have to deal with storage problems? And do you not suffer from transfer rates, which are too low for very likely the file size you are processing in your photography? And they are absolutely right. So I said, I want to use the opportunity. I'm happy to review this gadget, which is already here in front of me on the table. Come to it in a moment. And we'll do a video about it. And what we essentially have here is called the D1 SSD Pro, and it's a portable SSD enclosure. So there is no storage inside that box here or that case. It's nothing more than a case that will host storage in form of an SSD. And that's what I also made sure I have here with me. That's something I purchased for myself, of course, with my own money. It's an 8 terabyte SSD from Samsung. Here you find the compatibility acronyms you need to get this fitted into the case. It's an NVMe M.2 SSD, which is compatible with this portable SSD enclosure. So I will in a moment get this assembled into the SSD enclosure, and then we'll test it out and transfer large file size files from my MacBook Pro to that D1 SSD Pro with the Samsung SSD mounted. And we'll see how this plays out. And maybe this is a solution I will use for myself going forward. I use a lot of external SSDs, not necessarily SSDs where you first have to mount the NVMe into a case, but already ready to go SSDs from Samsung, you know, from SanDisk, what have you. And I always have issues if the transfer rates are too low. I really want to have high speed because I transfer really large files. And that's what we are going to explore in this video. In this box, when it arrived in a package, and I unboxed it already because I was curious what's inside, there are basically 4 items. One is the SSD enclosure. And the moment in time you feel this in your hands, it feels cold. And it feels like you would not need any active cooling, even if you transfer at high transfer rates, large file size documents and images, videos, what have you, between your MacBook Pro and between the external storage. It is really cool in hand. And that's one of the big features of this D1 SSD Pro. It doesn't need any cooling. And if we look here, this is basically based on passive cooling because the material is all aluminum, and it also has this vented structure here, which makes sure that the SSD which is mounted inside doesn't get too hot and overheat. The second item that was in the box is a pouch. It's a very solid pouch here with a very nice zipper, and it has a cable included here, That's a USB-C to USB-C cable, just right for my MacBook Pro. And you can fit that SSD enclosure inside here to keep it portable for transport. Look at that. Very compact. It has quite some weight, a bit more than the smaller external SSDs you can purchase from Samsung, SanDisk, what have you. But it will also promise much higher transfer rates, which we are going to explore in the course of the video, of course. So there is a nice pouch, and that's the second item that was in the box. And then we have a tool included, and that tool here is a screwdriver because we need to disassemble the SSD enclosure to get the SSD mounted, of course, and I'm going to live demonstrate this in a moment. So all in, we have 4 items in the box: the tool, the enclosure for the SSD, the pouch, and the cable. And regarding the cable, I want to make an upfront remark. Don't use any other cables for this type of encounters than the one which is delivered in the box. And if you look here, I don't know if you can read it. This one here says 80 gigabit per second. And that is basically what the packaging is promising here. If you use any other USB-C to USB-C cable here, you will very likely not harvest that super high transfer speed that is promised by the D1 SSD Pro. So always stick to the cable that is shipped with the enclosure to make sure you can get to the transfer rates as promised. And I think the next step is to disassemble this, get the Samsung SSD into the SSD enclosure by using the tool. And then I'll bring my MacBook Pro into play here and we'll start to measure what the transfer rates are we can squeeze out of this equipment here. Now let's get this SSD enclosure open. And I used the tool here that was shipped with in the box. Let's get this open here. I just have to unscrew this. It's very simple. It's opening. And I think now we can open this up here. And we have here is basically the slot where we can insert the NVMe from Samsung. And I'm going to open this now up here. Let's see what we have. How is this to be opened? Oh, here I need my Swiss tool, my knife. So I'll stop the video for a second and be back in no time. Ooh, so finally an opportunity to use my Swiss knife, my Swiss tool again. I always like to hear the sound when the blade comes out. A lot of people always ask me, where do you have it from? I don't know. I forgot. I have it for many years, but it always serves its purpose when we need to unbox something. So listen to the sound. Boom. And now we can open this up here. I think this is here. Let's get into it. Careful not to do any damage to anything, including my hands and fingers. And then safety first. Let's slide the blade in and put it aside. And let's see now if we can open this up, if it is opened. And also making sure that we don't get any damage to the electric circuits from handling this in the wrong way. Let's see. Look here, beautiful. This is not a video about Samsung SSDs, but these type of chips always look beautiful. 8 terabyte. Let's get this out carefully. And actually we only have to slide it in here, but before, let me place this again in here. Before, let's unscrew the screw which later holds this SSD and keeps it in place. Let's get this open here. I've done this many times. See, the screwdriver is magnetic. I'll show you here, you see. That's very convenient because then it doesn't lose the screw. And now we can slide this in here. So we just position it like that. We give it a little bit of a gentle push, not too much. And then I place it aside here for a moment and use the magnetic property of the screwdriver to actually get the screw onto the screwdriver. Look here. And now we can get this back and try to gently get the screw screwed in again. And it will hold this Samsung SSD in the SSD enclosure. Simple like that. A little bit of a push, not too much. We don't want to damage anything. And look at that. Screws are not harmed. We can unscrew this later. We can take the SSD out if we want. And it looks good and is mounted. Now here is a protection sticker on a thermal pad, and we need to remove this carefully, of course. And this will basically channel heat to the aluminum chassis here and will make sure that we don't need active cooling. And all we have to do now is to assemble this together again. And for this, we just, see here, there is something that fits into these spare outs. So we just do it like this and make sure we get the screw firmly screwed in again, which we do here. And then this should sit solid like a rock, meaning the SSD inside the SSD enclosure. Look here, that's it. Here is the USB-C port, and as promised on the package, it should deliver transfer rates up to 80 gigabit per second. Beautiful. And as I said before, when I had it first in my hands, it feels cool, nice, and valuable. And it comes with a pouch we can use for transportation. So let's get the cable here, which was shipped. Let's get this opened here. And let's see. Here we go. Then we have 2 protection caps here. And now basically we need the USB-C port here and need to connect it to my MacBook Pro. Let's go here and let's see if the SSD inside is recognized. And it immediately asked me allow accessory to connect. My MacBook Pro is like a fortress. So here we go. And it was not readable by the computer. Let's initiate and initialize. So we go to Samsung and we go here to erase. And we say this is the D1 SSD Pro. And we choose in the format APFS for our test, and the GUID partition map, I think that's fine. And we erase it. Let's see what happens. You always need to make sure in these kind of exercises, you're really erasing the external disk you have in mind and not your computer. So let's go and erase it. And then it starts its thing here. And you see we get a little bit of a report here, unmounting disk and so on. And it's already done. This is pretty fast. All right, now the storage is ready. It says 8 terabyte here on the capacity. And I think this looks good. Now, of course, we could start to experiment to see how quick it is to drop a raw file and all these type of things. But what I want to do is I want to do something different and also measure the time. I want to use my Photos Mediatek here, my photo library on my MacBook Pro and basically copy paste it to the D1 SSD Pro with that Samsung 8 terabyte SSD mounted. And I will copy paste it. I will place my mouse pointer here, will go to Command V and start here the clock. And then we see it's preparing to copy. Let's see how long this takes. And I will be back when the job is done and my photo library is dropped onto this new D1 SSD Pro. Quick interim update. We got the job almost halfway done here. You see the progress bar, and we only had run this so far for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Amazing. This is by far the fastest drop of my photo library into an external folder I've ever seen, because I do these type of backups many times, and typically with my fastest external SSDs, it takes at least 35 to 50 minutes, depending on what SSD I'm using. And this is super, super fast. The indication is another 3 minutes. We're coming close to the end. It's 4 minutes, 45 seconds. And by the way, it's absolutely silence. Since the D1 SSD Pro has no active cooling, there is zero noise, and I fully appreciate it. And it looks almost like the job is completed. We are getting now to 5 minutes and we are almost done. Let me get my fingers on the stop button here so I can stop this, and we are there. That's it. It's copied, right? About 5 seconds says the preview here on the progress bar, but we should be done in a moment. This is it. 5 minutes, 16 seconds. this is amazing. As I said before, it normally takes me about 40+ minutes to get my full photo mediathek, my photo library on my MacBook Pro dropped into an external folder. And we talk here about 1.76 terabyte of footage. In about 5 minutes, 1.76 terabyte were fully copied to this D1 SSD Pro. Absolutely amazing. Let me also take it in my hands and see. It's a bit warm, but it's not hot. So the passive cooling seems to really work. And that is proof of concept that we don't need active cooling if the SSD is in this SSD enclosure. Absolutely amazing. Let's do a little bit of math to entertain ourselves now. All right, so the file I transferred was my photos library with 1.76 terabyte, but it's not actually a file, it's a package. And there are thousands of files and folders in that package. And I will come back to that point in a moment in the course of the discussion. For your convenience, I've also copy-pasted screenshots here with the data points we need. So the D1 SSD Pro has 80 gigabit per second. And maybe a word of caution here. It is very important that we distinguish here the lowercase b and the uppercase b. If we talk about GB with lowercase b, we talk about gigabit. If we talk about GB with uppercase b, we talk about gigabyte. And the difference between the two is a multiplier of 8. And the specifications for the TerraMaster actually tell us that we can go as fast as 80 gigabit per second, but in order to convert this into gigabyte per second, we have to divide it by 8, which leads us to 10 gigabyte per second. Now the Samsung NVMe, the 9100 Pro, definitely is not a bottleneck for that SSD enclosure, because we have here in the data 14,800 megabyte per second, and that's of course 14.8 gigabyte per second. So we compare here in the enclosure transfer rates and speed of 10 gigabyte per second with theoretically possible 14.8 gigabyte per second on the Samsung NVMe. Now we transferred 1.76 terabyte in 5 minutes and 18 seconds. I rounded this up a little bit. You see here still on the left hand side on the screen the 5 minutes and 16.85 seconds, but I also had, and you saw that in the live view when I was doing the exercise, I had to move the mouse pointer from the right hand side to the left hand side. And I think this cost me about 1 second before the clock started ticking. So I give it here 5 minutes, 18 seconds. That's of course 318 seconds. And if we look at 1760 gigabyte, that's the 1.76 terabyte, which we transferred in 318 seconds, then this gives us a transfer speed of 5.53 gigabyte per second, multiplying by 8, as I just explained, gives us 44.3 gigabit per second. Summarizing, we measured 44.3 gigabit per second, but we talked before about promised 80 gigabit per second, and the Samsung NVMe, as I explained before, definitely is not a bottleneck for the super high transfer rates. So where does the gap come from? Let's quickly look into that. And in order to understand the gap, we first need to ask how fast can the MacBook Pro I'm working with actually supply data? Because the copy-paste procedure we did here was reading my photos library from the MacBook internal SSD and then transferring it to the TerraMaster external SSD. So I used a command line here in the Mac terminal, which is based on FIO, which stands for File Input Output Tester. And I basically tried to find out what is the internal read rate of my SSD. And the result is here in the red boxes at the bottom of the page. It's 7,121 megabyte per second. That was consistently measured. And I also did run the procedure a couple of times, and the MacBook was not hot at this point in time. So this seems to be kind of the ceiling what my MacBook internal SSD can deliver in terms of read speed. So it's a buffered sequential read test on the internal SSD in the MacBook Pro, which gives us about 7.1 gigabyte per second. in the way I just explained. And again, if we multiply this by 8, we end up at roughly 56.8 gigabit per second. So summarizing this now, we get basically to the bottom of it. We measured in the transfer of the photo library 44.3 gigabit per second. The SSD in my MacBook Pro seems to have a ceiling at 56.8 gigabit per second. And that basically means the real comparison is no longer between 44.3 and 80. It's actually between 44.3 and 57. And the 57 is the constraint coming from my internal SSD, where the files are read from before they can be transferred to the TerraMaster external SSD. So the 80 gigabit per second, as I showed them on the package several times, they are constrained now by the read speed of my internal SSD. And the remaining gaps, if we compare now instead of 44.3 with 80, and instead of that compare 44.3 with 57, the remaining gap comes from unavoidable overhead in the data path. So for instance, USB storage stacks have multiple overhead layers. The NVMe has a USB bridge. We have a USB packet framing. The OS file system has buffering. The APFS file system and the Mac OS input-output scheduler, they all put additional burden to this copy-paste process, and each layer adds a small penalty, and together they explain the remaining difference of measured 44.3 gigabit per second versus 57 gigabit per second by the constraint of the internal read speed of my internal SSD in the MacBook Pro. And then on top of that, I mentioned it at the very beginning, I did not copy one super large file here. I copied my photos library, and that's not a big file. It's actually tens of thousands of files, photos, videos, folders, which makes real-world transfers inherently less efficient than a synthetic benchmark, as they might have been run on the SSD Enclosure on the Samsung NVMe, and as I did run it on my internal SSD. And that, I think, explains pretty well the gap we have of 44.3 gigabit per second versus 57 gigabit per second. And as I said, when the job was completed and the file was copied and dropped to the external SSD in the TerraMaster Enclosure, it was fast like nothing I've seen before. Typically, the process of copying my photos library to an external SSD is, depending on the external SSD I'm using, always between 35-40 minutes up to 50 minutes. Here I'm now able to copy my whole photos library with a package of 1.76 terabyte full of photos. I think I have about 30,000 photos in that library in just 5 minutes from my internal SSD to the external SSD in the TerraMaster Enclosure. And that is amazing. That is a huge gain of time. And it's, you know, one of the typical situations. You're going to leave the studio, you have your MacBook there, you think you should make another backup to be on the safe side. It costs you just 5 minutes. And while the copy-paste process to the external SSD is progressing, you can just clean up your stuff and pack your backpack. Easy like that. 5 minutes is really the fastest I've ever seen in this process I demonstrated live to you. Let's do another mini test, because the file size is of course no longer 1.76 terabyte, and a typical application for a pro photographer. I want to carry an image file to a client. Typically we use the internet for that, WeTransfer, Swiss Transfer, what have you. But let's say this time I want to have it on external storage. So I want to get the file on my D1 SSD Pro. And that's an image file I had actually to deliver to a client, and it's in the TIFF format, so uncompressed. And it has, I think, 400 plus megapixel, is 4.82 gigabyte. Let's copy paste it, Command Z, Command V. And with that speed, it will instantly end up on the external folder. Watch this. Here it is, boom, transferred. This is basically 1 second. So this is really insane in terms of speed, what's going on here. Let's test the SSD. Still a little bit warm, no change. And I think you don't need active cooling for these type of enclosures. So that really works for me. I'm now completing my backup. I always copy the photos, Mediatek, and my photo library. I copy paste my data folder with 3.04 terabyte on the disk for these 60,351 items. And the last folder I always want to backup is my desktop, because a lot of things I'm currently working on are sitting on my desktop. And you see this is almost completed here on the progress bar. This was very, very fast. And it's now also stored on the external drive. So my backup is significantly faster than what I ever experienced in the past. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me your thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel. There's always more to come. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and healthy. And of course, peace out.